everyone. I'm Susan Locke, welcoming you to this month's edition of Citizens Bulletin, the program that helps you know your role as an informed Pennsylvania citizen, with our host, Ashley Klingon-Smith. Ashley is the Pennsylvania State Director for Americans for Prosperity. Ashley, we look forward to the information you'll bring us today.
Well, hey, Susan, thank you so much. It is great to be back. A new month turning over the calendar from May to June, and I am very excited to have a timely discussion about some advances on the regulatory front, both in Washington and in Harrisburg. And I know that listeners are going to be excited to hear that, because we have been talking about regulatory reform at the state level for quite some time, and some exciting movement happened just last week in Harrisburg. So we'll look forward to talking about that. But I am elated to welcome Clint Woods, a policy fellow for regulations at Americans for Prosperity. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Executive Director for the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies, and in senior positions with the U.S. House Science Committee, American Legislative Exchange Council, and Recreation Vehicle Industry Association. He holds an MA in International Commerce and Policy from George Mason University and a BA from the University of Mary Washington. He is originally from the Pacific Northwest, but now resides in Delaware County, Ohio, so our neighbors to the west, with his family. So it is so awesome to welcome you, Clint, to Pennsylvania, albeit virtually. How are you all holding up in Ohio?
We're doing great, and thanks so much for having me, Ashley. I really appreciate the opportunity. Hopefully the weather is slightly better in Pennsylvania. We've got rain and thunderstorms, but we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners.
Yes, no, we have had that here too in PA, so you're not alone. But hey, I'm excited to hear some of what has been happening at the federal level. But first, I want to talk a little bit about some encouraging news coming out of Harrisburg. And that sentence is not usually a common part of my vocabulary. So I'm really happy to deliver this news. So we have been talking with you all about our economic opportunity portfolio for quite some time. The vision there is to empower people to earn success. And so we do that by working on policies in the regulatory space, in the fiscal space, in the employment and healthcare space as well. And so when it comes to the regulatory issues that Pennsylvania faces, we have not seen a whole lot of movement like so many other states that have been on the cutting edge, like Ohio, on this front. But just last week, we had some encouraging movement from the Senate Intergovernmental Operations Committee. So our version of the REINS Act, which was Senate Bill 5, sponsored by Senator John DeSanto, was passed out of committee. It was party line vote with one exception, and that was Senator Killian, actually from you listeners' neck of the woods. So I would encourage you to call Senator Killian's office and ask him why he wouldn't support such a critical effort at a time like this. And, what the REINS Act, our state version does is require the General Assembly to vote on any economically significant regulation. And that's defined as one having an effect on a state, municipality, or business community of $1 million or more annually. And so that was passed. And in addition, we were able to have Senate Bill 609 passed out of committee, and that is an automatic 3-year review of economically significant regulations. So two big movements, and I want folks to remember these are things that were introduced last year. Senate Bill 5 introduced in February of 2019. Senate Bill 609, introduced in April of 2019 by Senator Brooks. And so sometimes things take a while to work their way through the process, and none of us like that, and many of us are often frustrated by that. But stay encouraged, because the number of contacts that you are able to generate into offices helped us to just scale the importance. So anytime I'd email the committee executive director saying, hey, we've had an additional 150 contacts about regulatory reform into members' offices over the past 2 months. We've really got to get these moving. If I wasn't able to say that, but rather I just made the ask that these moved, I'm certain that I probably would have not received such a great response. So really grateful, as always, for your advocacy. And I just want to note something that the chairman, Senator Doug Mastriano, said on the floor right before they ran the bills. He said expensive regulations are just a hidden form of taxation. And, here in Pennsylvania, the latest numbers show that as of 2017, the Commonwealth had 153,661 regulatory restrictions in the code. And that number is frankly probably higher today. For contrast, our regulatory code is 140% larger than Arizona's and 40% larger than Missouri's code in terms of regulatory restrictions. And so we have got to, as we consider coming out of this shutdown, we've got to consider ways to get Harrisburg and Washington out of the way from the workers and business owners who are going to look at ways to just unleash, their businesses in the period of time of recovery that we're all going to start to witness prayerfully very soon. And so that's a little bit about what's been going on here in Pennsylvania, and I wanted to provide that update. But Clint, I know there's been a lot that's happened, largely for the better in Washington. So will you talk a little bit about kind of where we've been, where we currently are, and where we're going, a little bit about what the administration has done of late? I know they issued an executive order on regulatory relief just last week with 3 chief provisions. I'd love for you to talk about that. So the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And it's really exciting, the developments in Harrisburg. I think we're hopeful to see similar progress across the country. As you noted, so last week, President Trump issued an executive order on regulatory relief to support economic recovery. And that executive order contains 3 really important provisions that respond both to the COVID-19 crisis, but also a longer-term effort by Americans for Prosperity for our governments to support a stronger economic recovery out of this crisis. So one important provision is to ask federal agencies that have suspended or waived regulations in response to the crisis to consider permanently rescinding those rules. Those include things like restrictions on telemedicine, restrictions on the ability of distilleries and other businesses to make hand sanitizer, innovative solutions to COVID-19 testing that many agencies have looked at, as well as enforcement discretion policies that some regulatory agencies have adopted to provide additional flexibilities in light of the pandemic. The second major provision is to ask those agencies to leave no stones unturned, to try to explore additional regulations and red tape that may get in the way of the recovery we need in response to COVID-19 at all levels. And the third really important provision is one that is, I think, is applicable during a non-emergency, but it's a regulatory Bill of Rights that outlines the need and principles for fairness in how regulatory agencies conduct administrative enforcement. So we've seen for a number of different federal environmental regulations under things like the Clean Water Act, we've seen different actions that are often arbitrary by the enforcement divisions of those agencies to issue administrative orders for violations of things like the Clean Water Act without any judicial review, requiring tens of thousands of millions of dollars of fines and without any recourse for those property owners. So it outlines a number of new points of emphasis and principles for those agencies to follow. So we think this is really exciting, helps to connect the dots between some of the things that we've seen in response to the crisis and how we can move forward to recover stronger. And we strongly think that states around the country should consider following President Trump's lead to remove additional barriers to economic opportunity based upon what we've learned in the last few months.
Wow, great. One of the bills that the Intergovernmental Operations Committee here in Harrisburg will hopefully next be considering is called the Red Tape Reduction Act. It was also sponsored by Senator DeSanto, who sponsored our version of the REINS Act, and it orders a 6-month review of the PA Code for transparency of mandates and implements the 1-in, 2-out model for new regulations. That was done at the federal level at the very beginning of President Trump's term. Is that right?
Yes, that is right, Ashley. That was implemented a couple of different executive orders by President Trump that helped to ensure that we weren't adding additional red tape to the books that cost more than the benefits, and then also the 2-for-1 trade-off, which has been tremendously effective at keeping down regulatory accumulation at the federal level.
And is there any single source to look at or that listeners and our team here at AFP Pennsylvania could cite to legislators in Harrisburg about the effect of that order?
So there is a few very valuable sources. So under those 2 executive orders and numbers, but the White House Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, has issued annual reports that take a look at the overall regulatory costs and benefits, both in general, but in terms of those two requirements. So the White House has a few resources that help to illustrate the value of those policies. And then there's a number of, I think, very highly valued third parties that have weighed in on these topics, like the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, my alma mater, that has helped to outline the tremendous value in reducing unnecessary regulation that has resulted from those executive orders.
How great. Okay, wonderful. We will certainly take a look. And listeners, I want to take a moment to remind you our inbox is info.pa@AFP, as in Americans for Prosperity, HQ, as in headquarters.org. So if you want to shoot a note straight to our inbox that's monitored virtually hourly every day, just shoot a note to info.pa@afphq.org, and I'll be happy to send some of those resources that Clint just cited your way. But Clint, I know you have been working quite a bit recently with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and they've really been a partner in this federal regulatory conversation. And I believe they started a campaign entitled #NeverNeeded. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what sort of traction that has seen since it was first unveiled?
Absolutely. So our friends at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a Washington, D.C. based think tank that focuses on regulatory policy across a number of different areas, started this campaign early on after COVID-19 became a high priority in March. And really, I think they started this state at a level that were being rescinded as either directly contrary to responding to COVID-19, things like restrictions on developing tests or developing hand sanitizer, regulations that were really kind of silly in the context of social distancing, the need to be able to deliver groceries to someone's house, or considerations of other essential goods or food trucks to sell at rest stops and things like that, that really, if the crisis really revealed that this red tape did not achieve its intended goal, of whatever it was used to put it in place, and that probably should not only be temporarily suspended but rescinded permanently. And so that effort, if you go to Twitter and look up #NeverNeeded, you'll see a number of examples. And the Competitive Enterprise Institute, as well as our colleagues at places like Americans for Tax Reform and American Action Forum, have done a really good job cataloging just the breadth and depth of these regulations that we think, even in a non-emergency, don't make any sense and probably add and add most, I think, to the costs of the least fortunate among us who may have to pay more for higher costs of housing or transportation or food or energy. These regulations really end up piling up and having a disproportionate impact on all of society, but especially those that are the most in need. So we think that campaign really helps to articulate and really to help communicate that message that this crisis has demonstrated that many aspects of our regulatory state is outmoded and unnecessary permanently, and we should pursue those key red tape reductions in the future.
No, I so appreciate that. And I have to tell you, here in Pennsylvania, we are hovering at just shy of 30% of our workforce having filed unemployment claims. And so the last thing that folks need and should be faced with are additional financial burdens caused by, an onerous regulatory state. I think I looked up that there are about 430 agencies, departments, and sub-agencies listed in the Federal Registry. Those agencies issue rules, non-binding rules, regulations, and guidance. Here in Pennsylvania, I think we have about 68 different agencies that can do that. And what we really want folks to hear and understand is that they cause high costs for compliance. And so that translates to negative impacts on economic growth. And the last thing that the nearly 30% of our workforce needs and the businesses that are prayerfully going to be hiring them back need is to be faced with those negative impacts. Economic estimates on effects of regulations range from 0.8% to 2.3% of GDP, which really does mean less wealth for everyone. And so that is just something that I think is a meaningful course of action for Harrisburg and Washington to take right now to alleviate some of the burdens and barriers that have just, been accumulating and have existed for quite some time. And it seems more timely now than ever. And so I'm so happy to hear that there is, a similar sentiment of urgency in Washington, which I don't think necessarily always is always the case. And I know I can say it's not in Harrisburg. I heard you, Clint, in a recent interview, talk about an article entitled, "Why Can't We Build Stuff in America Anymore?" Will you just talk a little bit about that? I think it would be incredibly compelling to listeners. This was published, I believe, is it The Weekly?
So I think it's been published in a few different outlets. So it's a piece by Mark Anderson, who's a Silicon Valley. He's sort of the inventor of the internet browser and a very important investor in the IT space. And really the point that he makes, I think, is a really critical one, which is, why can't we build stuff in America? Over the decades, we've had, I think, a lot of different changes in our regulatory code and our tax code, but whether it's skyscrapers or wind turbines or roads and bridges or, as this suggested, ventilators and hospital beds and vaccines, we have an inability to get from start to finish. And I think the takeaway that the example of constructing or widening a highway is the perfect one. There's never been a better time in our history than right now to go do work to build a new highway. There's not as many people driving as there usually be. There's not nearly as many nuisance concerns around noise and construction, and it's a tremendous opportunity. And labor costs and other things are as low as they will ever be. And yet the hoops that you'd have to jump through to build a highway in America today range from a wide variety of environmental statutes. So if you were to use a cent of federal funding or need any federal blessing in just about any infrastructure project that requires federal blessing and permits, you'd have to go through years and hundreds of thousands of dollars of reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as requirements under the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. You'd also, depending on where you're building, have to comply with requirements under the Endangered Species Act and noise standards from the Federal Department of Transportation. coastal zone management requirements. If you're building on a floodplain, there's a whole separate list of requirements. You're required to plant wildflowers for the landscaping of the highway for a certain percentage, and even beyond environmental issues, there's a wide variety of other strings attached. So Davis-Bacon requirements at the federal level that require that you pay prevailing wage, which is to say unions get first chance to bid for the construction project in the first instance, even where a more competitive offer may exist. Similarly, requirements around historic preservation can hold you up for years and cost a lot. And so I see that those layers of red tape for folks who have a not in my backyard or NIMBY attitude towards growth and new development really holds us back. And I think this crisis helps underscore the opportunity to try and eliminate some of that red tape to building things in America that allow us to recover stronger.
No, absolutely. This reminds me, we held the Intergovernmental Operations Committee held a hearing in December at a Pennsylvania business, Martin's Famous Potato Rolls. And it's in Chambersburg, and that's actually where the hearing was held. And one of their team members, Tony Martin, testified that they have been just trying to move the entrance to their facility from one road to another. It's been a cause of safety concerns. There's been several accidents, and so they just want to take it upon themselves as a responsible business that feels a sense of obligation to the community that they're operating within to just change the entrance. And it has been a 5+ year process with our Department of Environmental Protection to work through everything they've had to work through to get that done. Ground has not yet been broken, and so the process remains in flux. And I just thought that was unbelievable. And so it makes me think about first a reform that is in committee still. It is called Permit Transparency. Senator Kristen Phillips Hill has sponsored the bill. It's Senate Bill 252. And she said, look, I have heard concerns from a number of individuals on the delays and uncertainties involved in the process of permitting, which leads to delayed start times on projects. It leads to frustration, and it leads to monetary losses for businesses. A lot of times folks in Pennsylvania are telling their legislators they don't even know where their permit is in the process or why it has been withheld. And so this bill seeks to really make the process more collaborative between business owners and government, and not something that's, burdensome and punitive. And so that, I think, is one incredible step in regulatory reform here in the Commonwealth. And then additionally, there is another bill, Senate Bill 253, sponsored by Senator Phillips Hill, called Regulatory Compliance Officer. And what that would do is say that each state agency would be required to designate an employee to serve the regulated community with advisory committees and assist in non-compliance scenarios prior to levying a penalty. And I think that sort of, that sort of approach is so much more healthy for both the regulators and for the regulated community. Would you agree?
I would agree wholeheartedly, and I think it's one where all of the reforms that Pennsylvania is considering, none of them are a silver bullet. And we've seen that the regulatory state is so big and bloated that it takes a multifaceted. You need greater legislative accountability. You need greater transparency. You need a mechanism to reduce red tape that's accumulated over the years. I think it's critically important to think about all those pieces fitting together when it comes to fundamental regulatory reform and ultimately greater prosperity.
Absolutely. Clint, thank you so much for joining us. As always, I want to direct everyone with a call to action. And so, as always, that involves visiting AmericansForProsperity.ivolunteers. That's ivolunteers, that's plural.com. And go ahead and search for the letter entitled Stop Blocking the Promise of Pennsylvania. And when you sign that letter, it talks about the 153,000 plus regulations that restrict our businesses from really thriving, and is robbing them of the opportunity to grow and create more jobs and invest in our communities. When you sign this letter, it will go straight to your member of the State House and State Senate. And so it is so important that we continue to fill those inboxes with contacts about these critical and timely issues. So if we think about recovery, it's got to include regulatory reform. Happy to see that the president and the administration is doing it at the federal level, and happy to see Harrisburg is hopefully following suit, because it's certainly complementary and I know welcome by businesses and workers alike. So once again, AmericansForProsperity.ivolunteers.com, and the letter that you can search for is Stop Blocking the Promise of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, everyone. Clint, I don't know if you have a final word, but it was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and really appreciate. I'm enthusiastic about what's happening in Harrisburg, and please continue to be bold. Thank you for your leadership.
Absolutely. Great. Everyone stay safe and stay healthy, and we can't wait to see you in person, hopefully sooner than later. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ashley and Clint. We appreciate this report that you've brought us today. The information is excellent. Listeners, I know that you appreciate it as much as we do. We thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us again next month for another edition of Citizens Bulletin, knowing your role as an informed Pennsylvania citizen, here on 1180 WFYL, where we are working for your liberty and things that matter. Have a great day.